in the Americas. His forthcoming book, The Sports Revolution, How Texas Changed the Culture of American Athletics, explores how Texas-based sports entrepreneurs and athletes from marginalized backgrounds transformed American sporting culture during the 60s and 70s, the high point of the Black freedom and second wave feminist movements. Frank has also done a number of fantastic Columbia 68 teach-ins about activism on campus and has always been a fantastic supporter of the union. I had him my first semester at Columbia for my American history introduction class, and I definitely thought that Columbia was going to be a much more radical and activist place thanks to that introduction. And yeah, really felt welcome into the community. So yeah, I want to introduce Frank now and turn it over. Yeah, we're super grateful for your support and really happy to have you.
Thank you, Susanna. Can you all hear me? Awesome. Thanks. I chuckled when you called this a teach-in because really this has been just a big learning experience for me. But I'm really delighted to be here. And number one, I'm here to declare my support for fair contract for the GWC, my unqualified support. I was spoke at the strike now 3 years ago in April 2018. When the struggle at that time was to ensure the recognition of the union at a moment when the administration was waging a war against the union to try to delegitimize the whole notion that graduate students are workers. And that battle has been won. And yet here we are now, you are, and I and many of us with you on the faculty, to ensuring that this next phase of the struggle is also won, right? That for a fair contract. And so I want to commend and applaud all of your efforts and your courage, and I'll do that again toward the end of my remarks, for taking a stand for what's right, not just at Columbia but really for the whole world, believe it or not, right? And I kind of want to situate this mobilization here in a bigger context, the context of now, and also the context, the larger struggle that we've been seeing in this country. So as Susanna said, I'm a historian of sport, but I'm really interested in sport and social movement. So I'm really speaking to you from the perspective of a social movement historian, right? The issue here, as I see it, means a lot to me because I was a beneficiary of graduate student unionization when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan way back when in the late 1990s. And I can assure you that my happiness as a graduate student, my development as a scholar, my coming to an understanding of what empathetic scholarly community formation looks like happened in large part because the struggle for unionization had been won at the University of Michigan in 1975. 1975, okay? So and Michigan certainly was not great. It was not a radical commune by any means, but it was a space where graduate students felt a sense of citizenship that I often do not see here at Columbia through no fault of you, but really through this longstanding, super hierarchical culture that we have here at this private Ivy League institution. As Susanna alluded to in her introduction, I'm a scholar, a teacher, and a citizen who tries to anchor himself in the Black radical political traditions, especially those that highlight the connections between race, class, gender, and sexual exclusion and exploitations. I'm thinking about the strands of political engagement that are epitomized by people like C.L.R. James, Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs, the Ella Bakers, the Angela Davises, the Audre Lordes, the Combahee River Collectives, the Barbara Ransbys, a graduate of Columbia University, the Robin Kellys, among many others, right? Those who've had classes for me have heard these names in my syllabi, and future people who will take my classes will hear me teach the work of these radical thinkers. So as Susanna also said, I'm a historian, so I'm going to do what we historians are paid to do, at least those of us who are lucky enough to be paid to do. I'm going to tell you a story. Let's start with the big picture. What's at stake in this strike, it seems to me, is not just a fair contract for the GWC of Columbia, right? This is really about a bigger struggle against the widening inequalities, income disparities, corporate domination, sexism, racism, homo and transphobia, police violence, right-wing politics, which seem to continue without end, right? All of these inequalities are alive and well, and they have been intensified and magnified by the crisis impelled by the COVID-19 pandemic and the disregard of the United States government for its citizens that resulted in over 500,000 people dying from the pandemic, right? So we have heard this before. You've probably experienced this in your own lives. You know, what has transpired over the last year has been the catalyzing and the amplifying of the inequities that had plagued the society for quite some time that predated the pandemic. At the same time, I think you should see yourselves, and you probably do already, right, within the midst of the freedom struggles of our time, really that have really been launched over the last decade. I'm thinking, of course, about the larger movement for Black lives, the Me Too movement, which we see very clearly in your demands around sexual harassment issues on this campus, the current struggles of working people everywhere. Indeed, what's at stake in this particular struggle is the fight for survival for all working people in a moment when they're fighting for their lives in many ways, right? It's not just here at Columbia, but what's going on around the mobilization of Amazon workers at Bessemer, Alabama. Look at what happened recently here in New York City with the successful mobilization of produce workers at Hunts Point, right? So we're in a moment here of resurgent labor activism, right? And I think it's tempting for people from the outside to view this struggle and to minimize it as a struggle of privileged Ivy League graduate students who are going to be professors. But as you've demonstrated in the cases that you make all the time, right, you're highlighting the absolute exploitation and inequities that are embedded in higher educational culture, institutional culture, right? The wonderful handouts you passed out around the adjunctification of faculty, the wide disparities between upper administrators and even tenured faculty like me, right? Among other disparities that we see every single day on our campus and throughout the country. So that's the bigger picture. Let's focus a bit more on, as I see what's happening here in your mobilization with respect to the institution's history itself. Susanna mentioned that I did a number of public history projects around the protests of 1968 that enveloped our campus and the surrounding community, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But really, GWC is just the latest group in a long history of constituencies who have struggled for justice and recognition on this campus. Look at the various divestment movements, starting with the anti-apartheid activism of the 1980s, right? In which students, demanded that the university divest from investments in apartheid South Africa. Look at the movements that helped create the ethnic studies department on this campus with the occupation of Hamilton Hall in the mid-1990s, which led to the creation of Caesar. Of course, and as Professor Eric Foner has said with me at the strike in 2018, this union movement is just part of a longer history of unionization that the institution has resisted every single time, right? So the same or similar strategies that you've been experiencing here, we've seen in other cases of unionization in the history of this institution. I want to zero in on 1968 because I think there's an element of the struggle there that I think is relevant for this struggle today. For those of you who don't know, in April of '68, students and members of the surrounding community, it wasn't just students, came together right here at Columbia University to take a stand against the university's complicity in the Vietnam War effort, in particular the university's relationship with the Institute for Defense Analysis, to stand against Columbia's expansionism into the surrounding Harlem Morningside Heights community, against the displacement of Black and Puerto Rican tenants in Columbia-owned buildings, and of course, to stand against the odious construction, the gymnasium that they were trying to build in Morningside Park, which had a racially segregated structure in the design of the building. The student protesters, with support from the surrounding community, occupied 5 buildings on this campus: Hamilton, Lowe, Avery, Fairweather, and Mathematics. And they brought the campus to a standstill until their demands were met. And many of those demands were indeed met. Now, obviously, we can't do this sort of mobilization today for a variety of reasons, the pandemic, but also the intensifying security apparatus that surveils and polices us every single day. So they had the advantage of doing that mobilization before the securitized state that we experience in this country since 9/11. But nonetheless, I think their mobilization is instructive. I don't want to romanticize the efforts of the strikers of '68. And they would tell you today, and they certainly told me this when I met with them 3 years ago when we had the 50th anniversary commemoration, that mistakes were made. There was some serious misogyny in that movement, serious racism in that movement as well, even though Black students were very much part of the pushback against that racism. But I want to single out one group that often gets overlooked, and that was the graduate students who occupied Fairweather Hall, where many of our offices are in the history department. Like members of today's GWC, they were a hodgepodge group of folks with different political orientations, different objectives. But they were united around one principle, that being a graduate student, that being a scholar in the making means more than simply pursuing your individual research projects. It means more than simply thinking about your employability on the job market, though that is very important. It means standing for a community. Hell, it means having the audacity to create a fair and equitable community, right? That's what you're doing here this week. You're standing for a university community that is guided by democratic participatory principles, which are radical ideas on our campus, as they are and in many campuses throughout the country. To stand for a community that rejects violence and militarization, right, and injustice. Indeed, I see the spirit of Fairweather Hall 68 here among you this week, just like I saw it in April 2018. I want to thank the strikers who've decided to take this stand this week. You've been a source of inspiration to me personally. I want to thank the graduate students for their courage. I want for your willingness to take a stand for a better institution, to have the audacity to believe that we could actually be a better institution. You're putting into practice one of the core principles, in my view, of the Black radical tradition, even as you stand for the simple right for a fair contract. I'm thinking about a text that many of you have heard me cite many times, and I will cite it again. Robin D.G. Kelly's 2002 book, Freedom Dreams, in which he wrote, quote, "Revolutionary dreams erupt out of political engagement. Collective social movements are incubators of new knowledge." I'm going to repeat that last phrase again. Collective social movements are incubators of new knowledge. This strike and the larger mobilization of the GWC, which going back to its earliest days in 2014, in my view, has been, in the Kelly sense of the word, an incubator of new knowledge, of a new understanding of what a Columbia institutional culture can look like, right? Indeed, as somebody who's been at this institution for 5+ years, I am in full agreement that we need a radical reimagination of our institutional culture. And I don't think that's a pipe dream. Having taught at the University of Texas at Austin for 11 years, that's an institution that is steeped in Jim Crow segregation, steeped in the legacies of slavery, steeped in the legacies of dispossession. And yet I felt like when I was there, that I was a part of a community that was producing institutional change. And it was producing institutional change because constituencies had rights. They had influence on policymaking, right? Some of those rights have been curtailed in recent years at UT. But having seen how institutional culture can change, I fully believe that we can produce that sort of change here at Columbia, right? You're advocating for an institutionalization of fairness and equity. Too often, I've seen over and over again, fairness and equity here at Columbia, is totally contingent on the goodwill of an individual faculty member, the goodwill of an individual administrator. But that model only perpetuates the paternalistic culture, and it keeps the kind of fundamental inequities in place that undergird this institution. Okay. When I was teaching my 68 class, I want to talk about the institutional culture shift because I think it's profound. I think that's what's at stake here, along with the contract, right? A new understanding of how we relate to each other across constituencies is what's at stake here. And that's what I think the institution's resisting too. I've been asked many times about the 68 protests. What are the legacies of the 68 protests? And as I said before, I'll say it again. You all, especially those of you who have been gathering here over the last couple of days, have been mobilizing here for years now, provide a clear answer to that question. I think the legacy of 68, the spirit of 68 lives on in the efforts of the GWC. It's living on this week, and it will live on as we move forward in the coming weeks and months ahead. That's my sort of spiel, my remarks. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, comments, questions, maybe questions about, other things that I didn't raise as well that I can try to answer.
Oh man, this is quite stressful.
There's a question here about tactics. Someone posed, are there specific tactics for change that I observed at UT that would be helpful to us now? That's a great question. I think that institution was operating in a different historical moment, obviously. Now hold on a second. Now that also was during the Bush era, which is interesting, right? But in some ways, I think we're facing a more repressive environment now, and I think that's because the institutional change that I was a part of there was the massive hiring of Black and other faculty of color on that campus. So I used to be the director of the Warfield Center for African American Studies after I received tenure at UT 2011. And part of my spiel was, and this is the honest truth, that between 2001 and 2013, the University of Texas at Austin, the former segregationist institution, hired 70 at least African American and African diaspora studies faculty. Think about that for a second, right? Across the university, across the professional schools. And that happened because there were resources. So there wasn't just a rhetoric of inclusion and diversity. There were actual resources with permanent lines that were institutionalized by the provost, by the dean, and down to the departments in partnership with Black Studies, right? So Black Studies at the time was not a department. So when they hired, they had to hire with departments. And the Center for Black Studies was really kind of in charge, not in charge of, but certainly had a direct hand in the hiring of faculty. That was how I was hired at UT Austin in 2004, right? So the context there was that there was a collaboration between administrators, believe it or not, department chairs, and faculty, right? And students, of course, agitating for these things even before those things took shape, right? So, when an institution works right, those things can be harmonized. I feel like I experienced that at the University of Michigan. In fact, we went on strike in 1998, the grad student union, and the strike was 2 days. And the institutional culture was such that, it was sort of expected that we're going to do this. The administration expected that we're going to do this. The strike lasted for 2 days, and maybe a little longer than that, but it wasn't very long. And most of our demands were met, right? I mean, it's a different context, right? And again, that's the context where the union had already existed for 20 plus years at that point, right? So, I think if there's a lesson from these experiences is that, something I said earlier, that you have to institutionalize structures of accountability and equity. They can't be ad hoc. That's what we always have here at Columbia. And I think that that's a major hurdle, particularly for a private institution. What's different about those institutions? Those are public institutions, right? But I think that this is why this particular struggle is important, because it really is. But it's consistent with the other unionization efforts that we've seen on this campus before, that Professor Foner has talked about over and over again, as somebody who's been here since 1969, or before that, actually. So, I think at its best, this step that we're taking here can further institutionalize the kind of equity aspiration that many of us have on this campus who are not graduate students, right? I mean, I think that's what I would say. The problem is that the bloated management class that governs our lives is, has to get on board with this somehow. And I think that's the real obstacle, obviously. Shall I just pick some questions from the chat? Is that what I should do?
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so convincing other faculty. So, there's the question here about how do we think we can convince other faculty that our fight is their fight and they should get off the sidelines? Well, faculty like me need to do a better job mobilizing them. It's been a lot harder, even Susanna and I talked about this, to do this in the Zoom world where we don't see people unless you're in a meeting. That's been really challenging. I think that the way to proceed is to try to, I'm going to sound ageist, is to try to find, I think there are plenty of faculty here who've been here for a long time who are obviously sympathetic and empathize and support the struggle. But I think a lot of people around here have been around here for a long time, and I think that that's a problem because it hamstrings even those who have goodwill into thinking that change is possible, because things have always been this way, quote unquote, right? So, I think the issue is to try to link up with faculty who have, concrete experiences at other institutions. Because at least we have a sensibility. I mean, I'm one of those people who are, we get that, okay, well, this doesn't have to be this way, right? That's one. I think that, I'm sure you've been doing this, but I would encourage, meetings with faculty during their faculty meetings. I mean, we in the Department of History have done that in the past. I think that that's something that can be done. I'm happy to try to encourage that if people see that as something that's possible. So because that's what happened in 2018. 2018, we had a coordinated effort to support the graduate students. We're meeting with students off campus, and I thought the support in my department was very effective. At least that was my impression of it at the time. Even those who were ambivalent about the strike, I think, understood what's at stake. And my sense of it, talking to faculty now, I haven't canvassed people, is I do think that support remains, at least in the worlds that I operated in Black studies and in history. So I think, you folks have a lot on your plate, and I'm happy to talk about it. But I think, some direct communication. There's a faculty group called QFACT, in which I know these are issues around justice and equity are constantly discussed. There's a way in which we can get that discussion going on there. So I don't have the impression that those efforts have been exhausted by any means. I think it's just a matter of better coordination, I would say, between people like me and other folks who are sympathetic. There was a question earlier I wanted to highlight. As I alluded to, racism and sexism and other forms of oppression can also manifest in labor movements. What do you see as important steps communities like GWC can take to set up anti-racist, socially just, and inclusive organizing structures and actions? Yeah. I think number one, and I'm telling you something you already know, indeed, probably everything I'm saying are things that you already know. I would imagine that graduate students of color feel a particular vulnerability. You're all vulnerable. All of you are vulnerable. Yes, all graduate students are vulnerable. But particularly here, when the numbers of Black graduate students are pretty small, when the numbers of graduate students from other marginalized communities are pretty small, I can imagine that it would result in a reluctance to get involved in the strike, particularly those who are like first year and second year students. I mean, I'm just speaking, what I imagine. I don't have any concrete evidence, but having talked to students over the years, that's always been my impression. I mean, you see similar feelings around the undergraduates of color here, right? One of the wonderful things about the 68 conference we did was that we had a panel with the 68ers who were on strike, along with current students. And one of the things that they said over and over and over again, meaning the current students at that time, was the enormous vulnerability that they felt as a Black person, as a Black student on this campus, right? So again, this, but I think that acknowledging the vulnerabilities that they feel is significant. I think doing what I just did. I think you're all smart. You should think about your struggle within these longer Black radical traditions that have had labor struggles at the forefront, right, of their conceptualization of racial justice. I mean, one of the things that you see since the Floyd protests of last year is a very liberal conception of anti-racism. And what do I mean by that? Right, a notion that we just need to kind of learn how to not be racist, how to be nicer, how to hear Black people when they speak, but don't address the real inequities that undergirds structural racism, right? So that we focus on more privileged Black folks, to be honest with you, instead of those who've suffered the most from the pandemic. The subway worker conductors, for example, the delivery workers. Look at the people who congregate right out here on 113th Street, who are all the delivery workers waiting for the deliveries to take you your deliveries, right? Those are the people who are not at the forefront of the anti-racist struggle now, right? So to think about even our Black student community in that vein is particularly vulnerable. It's important, I think, in your conceptualization of mobilizing. You probably know this already, but that's my initial thought. So that the struggle for a fair contract is fundamentally also a struggle for a more racially just graduate student community, right? Because graduate students are not going to come to Columbia if there isn't a fair, equitable stipend wage for them. They won't. And certainly graduate students of color will not. Why would they put up with that, right? So I think those are my initial thoughts about that question. That's what I would say. There's a question here. The language around this seemingly sacred and untouchable endowment, how do faculty see this lump sum of money and its supposed inaccessibility? And how do you think we could talk productively about rethinking its function? Yeah, great question. The endowment and the university finances are mysterious, and they're intentionally so. One of the again, comparing this to a public institution, it was a lot easier to kind of advocate at a place like the University of Texas because things were at least performed transparently. Budgets were actually not novel. In fact, you would actually see budgets. You would actually see certain things, right? Even as the most hidden details of the finances of the institution were kept secret, but nonetheless, there was a culture of like, okay, here's our numbers, here's our budget, here's our lines, etc. We don't have that here. And I think the endowment, the workings of the endowment are as mysterious to faculty as they are to you. At least I will speak for myself, but I think that's true. And I think you have rightly highlighted not just the endowment, but who has taken a hit during this pandemic on this campus and who has not, right? And I think that's a message that has to be pounded down. I'm pounding my radiator here over and over again, right? Because I was struck by the language in, and I respect Professor Katz Nelson. He's an eminent scholar, but he's in the seat of the provost position now. And when he, gestured at people making sacrifices, not everybody's made sacrifices as a result of this pandemic. And in fact, the sacrifice that even faculty were asked to make we were not asked. They were just imposed upon us, to be honest with you, right? So, and faculty, to be sure, are very upset about the way things have been handled since the pandemic began, right? So I think that this question overlaps very well with the things that I've seen among faculty in arts and sciences anyway in recent months, in which they're very upset about the lack of transparency in the austerity measures that the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences is supposedly under, that started before the pandemic, and now the pandemic has just accelerated that discussion. Or those programs, or at least the proposal of austerity measures, right? So I think that the real way to proceed is to really push back against this austerity language. And I think faculty have been doing that already. I guess that's what I've been saying. So that now, I haven't been to arts and sciences meetings recently, but it's my impression that at least the administration of arts and sciences understands that faculty are not happy about the way in which some of the so-called budget crisis in arts and sciences has been at least made manifest to us, right? So I think pushing back on austerity, and again, there's ways in which we can communicate with faculty who are mobilizing around those issues, I think is important, so that you can see their parallel lines of struggle there. It is absolutely true that some faculty just need to be convinced, and they may never be convinced, and you just have to accept that, and that's just the case with any social movement. You have to accept that certain people are never going to agree, even if you think they should. But my impression, at least, of the way people were talking about the 2018 strike, and I imagine even now, because of the COVID crisis, I think that there's a lot of ground for commonality there between faculty and the GWC. There's so many questions. Oh God, where do I go next? There's a question here about Columbia expansion. What steps can we take as graduate workers to fight Columbia's expansion into and gentrification of Harlem? Yeah, that's a longstanding issue here. In fact, when the 2008 40th anniversary of the 68 protests convened on campus, the pressing issue that year was Manhattanville, the creation of the Manhattanville campus, and if you listen to the there's a lot of audio from that conference. You hear President Bollinger being booed at the event that he showed up at, and clearly a lot of that struggle was lost because Columbia expanded into Manhattanville. And, the big question here is what's going to happen with the proposed sites that are supposedly being brought to the benefit of us as students and faculty here, right? So what's going on with that old McDonald's site? Like, I think the way to proceed around that question is like, what is actually happening with these sites that are under construction? Because that implies that, as that work stopped, does it continue? How do students benefit from that? Number one. And even more importantly, how does the surrounding Harlem community benefit in ways that are not just doing cosmetic programs at the forum, right? And I think that those things are still underway. Certainly, I think the big picture here, and I think you had a mayoral candidate at least show up or at least a couple at the strike this week. It's going to be really important to see what the candidates for mayor think about these questions, right? I think Diane Morales showed up at your at the strike, and she's an interesting candidate. She's under the radar, but she's posing some really interesting intersectionally feminist, women of color inspired issues into the mayoral race. So I think figuring out who the elected officials and the people who are organizing around these issues is really important. But I think as members of this community, we can ask a whole lot of questions about what we're doing with that space in Manhattanville, right? So if we lost the battle for the building of that space, that doesn't mean that space can't be reconfigured in ways that are actually beneficial to the surrounding community. And I think that some of that work has been done. I know that even faculty in the new Black Studies department, that's been a concern for us. But we have to be better on that issue too, to be honest with you. Part of our efforts have been really hamstrung by just trying to build the program, and a lot of that has been stalled. We've gotten a lot of great press, but we haven't been able to hire anybody yet, because of the pandemic, supposedly. So so there's that. There's about building up the department itself, but Harlem, as a Harlem institution, as we see ourselves, these are issues that are really important to us, right? And so I think the things that we've talked about is like, okay, how can we really maximize the usage of these spaces that are supposedly for the Harlem community, which are there at the forum, and presumably are supposed to be there in the plans for the next buildings that are going up, like the ones at the McDonald's, the old McDonald's site on the corner of 125th and Broadway. Yeah, always the food boring Bollinger. I hear that. Okay. Let's the chat questions coming fast. I see one here. I mentioned the huge growth power of administrative positions as one of the causes of the hollowing out of professorship in the United States, higher education. As someone with a lot of experience in different universities, do you think this can be curbed, or has the train left the station? Yeah. Is it just related to new expectations of new services delivered by universities to students, or something else? I don't think this is about new expectations from students. I have to believe that the train hasn't left the station. And maybe that's just me being overly optimistic. I have to insist that we must advocate for a professorship for the 21st century. And now that professor class may look different than the days of the gentlemen scholars who roamed this campus, who dominated this campus until recently. Well, they still do to some degree. But if we don't fight for the integrity and the importance of knowledge producers as a career, then what's the point? Why are we even here, right? And so to me, that has to be a constant struggle. So that means we have to take advantage of the things that we've seen rhetorically from higher administrations, higher educational institutions since the George Floyd protest, for example, right? So there's all these promises. So we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to be more woke on racism, we're going to hire these people, we're going to hire that. We have to hold these institutions accountable. In beyond just diversity, inclusion, anti-racist statements, right? So to me, like every moment when we have an occasion to hold an institution accountable, we must do it. We have to do it. I'm speaking for myself as a faculty member. In fact, that's what we've done. We tried to do since the protest last year. That's work. That's not just the work of marginalized scholars. That's everybody's work, as far as I'm concerned, right? If in one of the lessons of last year, it has to be that we all have to have an investment in a struggle against systemic racism, right? Because it's interconnected. It's not just something that concerns Black people, even though Black people should take the lead on those questions, right? Um, so, I think that it's constantly looking for the moment to strike. Yeah, and that's all social movement work, as far as I'm concerned. And that means, yes, not being satisfied when the upper administration says, we'll give you a postdoc who will teach a class here and there. It's really doing what we did at UT Austin, which is hire permanent faculty. That's what we did. Um, and the vast majority of those faculty got tenure. It's just kind of hard to believe, to tell you the truth, right? That wasn't that long ago. I'm not talking about 50 years ago. I'm talking about 11, 12, 13, 14 years ago, right? So I can't believe the train has left the station. We have to continually hold this institution and all of our institutions accountable. And there's a lot of great work being done out there right now among radicalized faculty on envisioning the new university. I'm thinking of the work that the group, the Scholars for Justice, have done. Barbara Ransby, DeVarian Baldwin, others, focusing on a range of issues from policing on campus, but not just policing on campus, reimagining public safety, all that sort of work. But, deeper than that, or along with that, are these issues that you're raising here, right? So there is a national movement of radicalized scholars trying to do this work, and so I think that work just has to continue, even if it looks like we're not winning the battle. If we just give up, then I don't know why we're here. That seems to be a defeatist attitude. It seems to me, which is not. I'm not saying you're suggesting that, but I'm just encouraging you to not think along those lines. I'm the faculty coordinator of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, which is a Mellon Foundation program that tries to diversify the professorate. And to be sure, we have to figure out how the next generation of scholars like you have to learn how to communicate their knowledge differently than just publishing scholarly monographs and articles. Public-facing work is extremely important. Public scholarship is extremely important. But that's work, that's skills that are being developed. That doesn't mean that the work of the knowledge producer, scholar, or teacher is over by any means. I'm looking at other questions. What would be my advice for dealing with positions that fixate on the fact that Ivy League graduate students may not be the most vulnerable population, essentially and disingenuously turning this into a zero-sum game? RE other workers. Yeah, I'm sure that's something you hear over and over again. And, even as I thought about this, and when I was speaking earlier, that is an absurd proposition that, somehow the struggle of a GWC is just not as important as other struggles. You're fighting for the same things, actually, that most workers are fighting for, right? And just because you happen to be at a private Ivy League institution doesn't mean that these aren't legitimate concerns, right? Otherwise, then then we're engaging in sort of silly Olympics of oppression, politics, which are really counterproductive, right? And I think you have rightly linked your struggles to a broader frame, and that's how it has to be over and over again. I would reject those comparisons every single time. While understanding your privileges. Yes, you have privileges. Absolutely. You have a platform. Your strike might get covered in the New York Times this week. Hopefully it does. That may or may not be a good thing, but I would imagine it wouldn't be that bad of a thing. But so even as your privilege, I say this to the undergraduates all the time. I think the things that pissed people off about 1968, and I see this a lot from the alums who didn't support the strike of 68, is that they couldn't believe that white, and Black, but mostly white Ivy League students stood for the people in Vietnam, stood for the so-called Negroes and the Puerto Ricans in the surrounding community. Like that was unimaginable. That class of privileged white people could be, I'm going to use the language, race traitors, to actually stand for something else aside from their own American way of life that they were supposedly promised as Ivy League, privileged students in 1968. So when I see that kind of rhetoric, this kind of dismissal of this struggle, I really see it along that line. What you're facing is a pushback because you're supposedly privileged, and you shouldn't be standing for these things. These are things that more vulnerable workers should be standing for. But you're standing for the same principle. You're standing for the same, that work deserves dignity and deserves rights, and regardless whether it's a TA at Columbia or the gig worker who's working, for Uber or whatever, right? And so I think that's, again, you know this already, but I think you have to constantly remind yourself of that, because I'm sure you're facing a enormous pressure. I know even among probably for some of my colleagues who are like, well, I was in grad school and everything was fine with me, but the perceptions of some of my colleagues are not accurate. They don't really have a sense of what today's struggle to get a PhD is, as opposed to what it was at their time, and even in my time, 20 plus years ago. So that's what I would say to that. There's a question here. Would I say that Columbia is especially good at undermining its workers' happiness, particularly thinking of the pandemic response and how it affected many different people in different kinds of employment? One thing I do notice here, I have noticed, and I've said this probably to some of you before, and I don't know if it's because we're in a big city, New York environment, but Columbia doesn't do a good job fostering community. They do it for the alums who donate to the institution. When they bring them back for whatever they do in the summer every year or for homecoming. But one of the major struggles we have here is a notion of that we're part of a common something. Sometimes that's even hard to sustain, even in the Department of History, the department that that my primary department, although I'm also jointly. I mean, Black Studies is different. We actually do feel a sense of connection, but we have it's a smaller community, right? So it's why I mentioned this in my remarks. I think something that affects people's happiness, believe it or not, is the reluctance to believe that you're part of something here. That you're not just here to get your credential and go be a great person and receive all the privileges that an Ivy League education or a doctoral education gives you. That's a major, something very particular, I think, to this institution. It probably exists in other New York institutions and NYU, I suspect, but that's just something that should be, I'm sure you've thought about, but as organizers, I think it's a real issue, because it's also a product of the institutional culture, which is that it is highly individualistic, so that it's just you and your degree, or in my case, it's just me and my scholarship and my teaching and my greatness, right? Without a sense of, that we actually work in a common space, having worked on these issues in the Department of History, I saw that as a major issue. I think we made some strides on that front, not in terms of equity, but at least in some sense that we're actually, belong to something at the Department of History. And I think that's just something that has to be cultivated. But it can't be cultivated without these institutional changes, or it has to be cultivated along with the institutional changes, right? And I think that part of the pathologies of an Ivy League institution is that you either are encouraged to believe that you are great because you're here, and you are great, not you as part of a community, but you, the individual, are great. You're the great scholar. You're the great person who knows Foucault. You're the great person who knows this or that. But without you situating yourself in a knowledge producing community, and that's why things like sexual harassment and microaggressions foster here all the time, because there isn't a sense of commonality or accountability. So that almost has to be, if not a demand, it has to be enacted, constantly, all the time here. And I think that's just part of what's unique about this place. Whereas, the University of Texas, again, to compare it to this, I guess non-analogous situation, but I think it is analogous because it was a big bureaucratic institution. There are 50,000 students at the University of Texas, right? Or 20,000 faculty members or something like that. I think we were able to create enough sociability spaces to have a perceived commonality, which doesn't mean that we always got along, but like that has to accompany the organizing work or just the day-to-day work that we do, and I think that's a particular challenge that we face here at Columbia. I think, again, I'm sure you've experienced this, but it requires an intentionality to address. It can't be something that's presumed. Particularly when you're thinking beyond your own constituency, right? So, it might be it's challenging enough to foster that among yourselves as a union, or among yourselves, in the kind of micro community that you're a part of. But it really it requires intentionality beyond that. It really does. Okay, I'm just looking at questions, comments. Can I expand on the link I mentioned between focusing on the individual and not fostering community and the prevalence of microaggressions? Yeah. I'm speaking from the position of being a Black scholar at this institution. Because I think it's relatable to women scholars, to any queer scholars, any scholars or people, members of this community who entered this space that was not created for them, who are told that they're only here because they're great. I say this all the time. I'm sure Susanna has heard me say this before, that you're here not because you are representative of the communities that you come from, but that you're here because you are exceptional. You're not representative of Black people. You're not representative of queer folks. You're not representative of Latinx communities, right? So that does a number on you when you come to a place like this. And that can show up in different ways. That could show up in you feeling a sense, the good old-fashioned imposter syndrome, right? So that, if you feel a sense of imposter syndrome, you wind up sometimes looking to the wrong people for affirmation. I've told graduate students this over and over again, right? You equate your own self-worth as a scholar, as a person, with standards that were not created for you, right? So then you wind up trying to live up to those standards, perpetuating the kind of individualistic, how can I put it? Individualistic mindset that many of us are coerced to feel here at Columbia. And I'm not just saying grad students. I see this among tenured track faculty. It is very hard to resist that as a tenured faculty member at this institution, to be perfectly frank with you, right? I'm first gen. My parents didn't finish high school. I'm a New Yorker, born and raised, and I'm teaching at this place. Everything's telling me, oh, I'm great, right? That's like the last thing I need to be thinking right now, actually, because then you wind up acting in these ways that don't foster community. They only foster a sense of accountability to yourself or to the person who or the people who are the presumed authorities in your world. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm speaking abstractly, but I feel like it's so, because then you wind up in competitive situations in seminar, for example, right? Something I try to strike down in my own classes, but it's something I hear about. Certainly I experienced that as a graduate student at Michigan. There were a lot of people like that, or some people like that, who were there just to prove how erudite and how much Gramsci they knew, and not necessarily foster a kind of community learning environment, right? And I think that that's a particular struggle that, when you're vulnerable, you're really coerced to believe that, and I think it's, efforts like this, and even smaller efforts like writing groups, smaller efforts like, creating alternative sociabilities, which I know students have done here before, at least in my department. That requires a constant intentionality, and it requires you to trust your knowledge and trust what you know, and that you have something to bring into the classroom, to this community, right? As opposed to trying to live up to some sort of standard of what an Ivy League scholar is supposed to be. Ivy League scholar only matters if we're redefining it. Otherwise it's just, God bless Richard Hofstadter, but we need another iteration of the great historian from Columbia University, it seems to me. If there's something that's really pressing that I'm not mentioning here, please, or if you have a reaction or a disagreement, please feel free to raise that too. Yeah, self-promotion is a critical issue, particularly in this world of social media too. I think that's I've sermonized a lot about that, and I don't want to sound like an old man, so I'm not going to sermonize more about the dangers of self-promotion. I want to affirm something really fast here. It hasn't come up, at least maybe if it did in the chat. I really want to applaud the effort to really hold the institution accountable on Title IX harassment issues, because our policies are an absolute failure. And they are a failure not because they're bad people here or somebody. That's not why they're a failure. Structurally they're a failure. They're a failure because, number one, Title IX, equal opportunity employment, and affirmative action were programs designed to address inequities. And they have been completely distorted into programs that protect authorities who lord over inequitable structures. When there was a new faculty orientation when I arrived here in 2015, and it was time to give the EEOA presentation, again, as a Black scholar, I was absolutely floored that the entire presentation was not about, like, okay, here's how we're fostering inclusion at the institution, or here's how we're fostering, diversification of faculty, even watered down goals like that, to, okay, here's what you do, so you don't get sued. That was just unbelievable to me. But that has Title IX. I work on Title IX in terms of looking at its effect on the expansion of women in sports. And I mean, that's how I think of Title IX, right? Gender equality, not the protection of those in authority who foster toxic cultures, which is what in effect has happened, right? And so, and I as a faculty member felt completely hamstrung by our policies here. I'm a critic of actually mandated reporting. Having a little experience I've had with it, I don't think it really helps anything at all. And other institutions are starting to think about other models of how to address these concerns beyond mandated reporting, which, it's supposedly designed to protect victims, but it does not, right? So, the fact that you've made this a core position, I think is critical, and because, like, we have, it's just a failure, a complete failure. And, and I think you're right that faculty can't be the ones adjudicating these cases either, because we're too entangled in the situation. We are, we might think we're not, but we are. Having done this work myself, I know how difficult it is under the current structure. So, to me, that's a big picture. You could cast that aside, and focus on the compensation issue. And that would make sense. That may be the easier way to go. But the fact that you're not doing that, you really should be applauded for it, because, anybody, in the 2+ years that I was doing that kind of work at the institution, officially, I felt like whatever progress we made had nothing to do with those policies. It was everything about trying to kind of create new sociability and cultures and awarenesses, because the current structure just does not work. I mean, that's the understatement of the century. So I just want to say that. I want to affirm that, because, as a straight guy who was internalized, misogynistic, anti-feminist thinking myself, as a younger person, we need much more than a system that just makes sure people are not going to be protected and then are adjudicated behind closed doors. And that's it. That just doesn't work. It's a dehumanizing, horrible situation. So I really want to thank you for that. And and I think many faculty would agree, because we're all very frustrated with title. We can't stand it, actually, even as the institution thinks it's trying to make some changes. And yes, they have, we have these new briefings now that are good, and I guess, but a once a year briefing is not enough. It really isn't. Yeah, somebody's mentioning paternalism here. I think you're in the midst of the struggle, and you have to kind of, the question about, Provost's language around being affronted. I think you just have to see past that and just, I mean, and I respect Ira, so it's not I have no ill will towards Ira whatsoever, but he's in negotiation mode, and so are you, and you have to just see it like that. And I also, I will be perfectly honest with you, as somebody who sees himself as an ally, there have been a number of times when graduate students have told me, like, you're wrong, dude. And that might be hurtful, but that's just, we're in the struggle. That's what we're doing here, and I think I don't detect, any sort of, mean-spiritedness from this mobilization at all. And so, I understand that that's disheartening when you see an eminent scholar who's worked on these issues, take this position, but he's just filling the seat of the provost's office. That's what he's doing. I mean, that's my read on it. So I think that I think you just have to look past that and stick to your goals here as best as you can. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question here. Could I talk about how educators' labor of love often gets devalued through this idea? I'm sorry. Let me rephrase the question. Reread it again. Could I talk about how educators' labor often gets devalued through this idea of a labor of love, that we should accept lower pay because we're supposed to love our students, which we do, obviously. Yes, that is a rhetorical strategy to delegitimize the value of academic labor. Also, athletic labor, actually. I know that in the case of sports. Yeah, absolutely. Because our profession originated in, and it's still populated by people of the more leisured classes of our society, right? And that does shape the way I think some older folks and privileged folks see academic work. Academic work is work, just like the work of the scientist in the lab, of the plumber who's working on the Columbia buildings, right? So just because you have the privilege of potentially loving your work, but that shouldn't be something that means that you should put up with, mistreatment, right? And I mean, indeed, that was a lot of the rhetoric in 2018, or when the struggle for unionization was, really ramping up that year, which is that, well, you're students, you're apprentices, and you're, that's not, that you're not workers, right? But that's a absolutely flawed dichotomy that makes no sense whatsoever. Ideally, you're a worker who loves what you do, and if you don't love it every day, at least you have the ability to generate some benefits from it. Even if you even as you're wondering about whether you want to do this for the long term, in that sense, you're no different than any other American worker, as far as I'm concerned. So we're up against time. Any other thoughts? Yeah, one of the things that there's a comment here, and I say this and I will say it again, and I'm following the work of Barbara Ransby. I mentioned her, Black woman scholar, activist, Columbia graduate, GS graduate, who is a historian of Black social movements. Her most recent book, which you should check out, is Making All Black Lives Matter. And it was published in 2018. And what she argues in that book, it's like a survey of Black Lives Matter movement since over the last few years. And what she says is that this generation of activists is way more attentive to self-care and emotional toll than people even like me who are Gen Xers, right? In which we were told to just suck all that up and just accept that as par for the course. And sometimes I still think that, and I think that's wrong. But I think that this, highlighting the emotional labor, especially as you've been experiencing over the last year, by no means is this going to be the last catastrophe we're facing, and so, and I have seen some institutional shifts. I have seen, sometimes to the detriment of marginalized scholars, but I have seen administrators say, oh, yes, faculty of color, women faculty, they're facing, certain issues that majoritarian faculty don't face. That's a significant shift. I've seen that. That doesn't mean that people carry out policies that actually are based on that mentality, but at least I've seen rhetorically a notion that, marginalized peoples do the work of social reproduction, to use an old term, right? And I think that that's an important part of your identification of yourselves as this generation of activists, right? That's a parcel of your own subjectivity formation, I would say. Well, outstanding. Thank you. I hope this is useful, and reach out. I'm on email, and let's just keep moving forward.
Thanks so much, Professor Guridy. Frank.
Thank you.
It was so inspirational, so lovely to have you, and we really appreciate you taking the time. I'll send you some of the feedback I've gotten, but it's people, we're really moved by, we appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and until next time.